The congressional hearing took place in the Grand Chamber of the U.S. Capitol, packed to capacity with lawmakers, reporters, and political aides. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as everyone in the room knew that something significant was about to unfold. At the center of the event stood Congresswoman Karoline Leavitt, a rising conservative figure known for her strong support of America First policies. As she stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone, the room fell silent, all eyes fixed on her. The hearing's central issue revolved around a highly controversial Supreme Court ruling that had forced the Trump administration to release $2 billion in foreign aid, despite the president's executive order to freeze those funds. The money, originally earmarked for international assistance, was meant to be withheld in favor of domestic priorities, such as supporting struggling American families, veterans, and infrastructure projects. However, the Supreme Court's decision overturned Trump's directive, a move that Karoline Leavitt and many conservatives viewed as a betrayal of the American people's interests. Seated across from Leavitt was Amir Ali, a federal lawyer who had played a key role in defending the ruling. Beside him sat Justice Amy Coney Barrett, one of the Supreme Court justices who had voted in favor of releasing the funds. What made Barrett's involvement particularly controversial was that she had been appointed by President Donald Trump himself, leading many conservatives to expect that she would rule in alignment with their values. Instead, her vote became the decisive factor in the 5-4 ruling, leading to outrage among her former supporters. This hearing was not just about a single court decision, it was about power, accountability, and the growing frustration among conservatives who felt that Washington's institutions no longer represented the will of the American people. As the hearing intensified, Congresswoman Karoline Leavitt wasted no time in laying out her case against the Supreme Court's decision and those who had supported it. Her tone was sharp, unwavering, and filled with conviction as she addressed what she saw as a grave betrayal of the American people. Her primary target was Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a Trump-appointed Supreme Court justice who had been expected to uphold conservative values but instead cast the decisive vote in favor of forcing the Trump administration to release $2 billion in taxpayer money for foreign aid. Leavitt made it clear that the American people had been deceived. She reminded the chamber that millions of hardworking Americans were struggling to make ends meet, facing skyrocketing inflation, rising gas prices, and an economy that left many feeling abandoned by their own government. Instead of addressing these pressing concerns, the federal government had prioritized sending billions overseas. She called it a deliberate betrayal by the very institutions that were supposed to serve the American people. One of Leavitt's most forceful arguments was that the Supreme Court should not be in the business of overriding the will of the president, especially when it comes to protecting American taxpayers' money. She pointed out that President Trump had been elected with a clear mandate to put America first, and his executive order to freeze the aid was fully in line with that promise. Yet, through legal loopholes and judicial overreach, unelected judges had effectively nullified the president's authority and forced the American people to fund foreign governments. She also turned her attention to Amir Ali, the federal lawyer who had argued in favor of the ruling. Leavitt criticized the fact that Ali had only become a U.S. citizen in 2019 yet had played a crucial role in influencing national financial policy. She accused him of putting the interests of foreign nations above struggling American families, questioning whether he had ever truly experienced the hardships faced by millions of Americans. Throughout her speech, Leavitt repeatedly emphasized the disconnect between Washington's elite and everyday citizens. She accused the judiciary of prioritizing global interests over American livelihoods, calling the Supreme Court's decision a direct attack on the will of the people. Her argument struck a chord with many in the room, particularly among conservative lawmakers who had long felt that America's legal and political systems had been weaponized against them. For Leavitt, this was more than just a policy debate, it was a battle for the future of the country, a fight to ensure that government power remained in the hands of the people, not unelected bureaucrats and justices. As the congressional hearing escalated, Congresswoman Karoline Leavitt turned her attention toward Amir Ali, the federal lawyer who had defended the court ruling that forced the Trump administration to release $2 billion in taxpayer money for foreign aid. She wasted no time in challenging his stance, making it clear that she viewed his legal argument as an attempt to undermine the authority of the elected president and dismiss the struggles of the American people. Leavitt began by questioning why a single unelected lawyer had the power to influence such a critical financial decision, particularly when the funds in question had been frozen by a president who was elected with a clear mandate to put America first. She argued that the ruling was an overreach of judicial power, forcing taxpayers to foot the bill for foreign aid while American citizens were struggling with the rising cost of living, increasing homelessness, and a deteriorating healthcare system for veterans. Her words were sharp, direct, and aimed at exposing what she saw as the disconnect between Washington's legal elite and ordinary Americans. Ali, remaining composed, countered that his role was simply to uphold the law as it is written, not to serve any particular political agenda. He explained that under the U.S. Constitution, Congress controls federal spending, not the president, and once foreign aid has been approved through congressional appropriations, the executive branch cannot unilaterally freeze those funds. This, he argued, was a matter of legal precedent, not politics. Leavitt, however, was quick to push back. She mocked the idea that the court was simply following the law, pointing out that legal technicalities were being used to justify a decision that directly harmed the American people. She argued that if the system truly worked as Ali claimed, then it was proof that the system itself was broken. She demanded to know where in the U.S. Constitution it explicitly states that unelected lawyers and judges have the power to override the will of the people and force taxpayer money overseas. Then, she made the argument personal. She highlighted the fact that Ali had only become a U.S. citizen in 2019, questioning whether he truly understood the struggles of everyday Americans. "Tell me, Mr. Ali," she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism, "when was the last time you spoke to an American family who had to choose between buying groceries and paying rent? When was the last time you looked a veteran in the eye and told him he had to wait months for medical care while billions were being sent overseas?" Ali, for the first time, hesitated. It was subtle, a tightening of his grip on the microphone, a brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but Leavitt seized on it. She accused him of prioritizing the financial well-being of foreign governments over American citizens, demanding to know whether he had ever considered the working-class families whose tax dollars were being funneled away from their communities. The tension in the room was palpable. Some lawmakers nodded in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, capturing every exchange. Leavitt's argument was clear: Washington's elite, including legal bureaucrats like Ali, had lost touch with the American people. As Ali tried to reassert his legal argument, Leavitt cut him off once again. "You can hide behind legal jargon all you want," she said, her voice steady but fiery, "but at the end of the day, this decision wasn't just bad law, it was a betrayal." As the hearing continued, Congresswoman Karoline Leavitt turned her focus to Justice Amy Coney Barrett, one of the Supreme Court justices who had ruled in favor of forcing the Trump administration to release $2 billion in taxpayer-funded foreign aid. This, for many conservatives, was the ultimate betrayal, not just because Barrett had cast the deciding vote in a 5-4 ruling, but because she had been appointed by President Donald Trump himself, with the expectation that she would uphold conservative values and stand firm against judicial overreach. Leavitt did not hold back. She stepped toward Barrett, her voice sharp and unyielding. "Justice Barrett, you had a choice," she declared, staring directly at the judge. "A simple choice. You could have stood by the Constitution. You could have stood with the president who appointed you. You could have stood with the millions of Americans who fought to put you on that bench. But instead, you sided with them." She gestured toward Amir Ali, linking Barrett's decision to the bureaucratic elite that she argued had turned against the interests of the American people. The tension in the room was suffocating. Barrett remained composed, her hands folded neatly before her, her face unreadable. But Leavitt was relentless. She accused the justice of betraying the very movement that had propelled her to the Supreme Court. She reminded the chamber that Barrett had been fiercely defended by conservatives when she was attacked by Democrats during her confirmation hearings. Conservatives had believed in her, fought for her, and trusted her to uphold their values. And yet, Leavitt argued, when it truly mattered, Barrett had turned her back on them. Leavitt went further, questioning whether Barrett had always intended to rule this way. Was it pressure from the left, she asked. Was it the media? Was it fear of how history would judge you? Or was it something worse? Was it always going to be this way? A few gasps rippled through the audience as the weight of the accusation settled over the room. Leavitt was suggesting that Barrett had never truly been committed to conservative principles, that she had misled the very people who had fought for her confirmation. Barrett's silence was deafening. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of her expression. Reporters scribbled furiously, documenting the moment as lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some of Barrett's defenders looked uneasy, while they wanted to believe in her integrity. Leavitt's words struck a nerve. Then, Leavitt made her argument even more personal. She painted a picture of the real Americans affected by this decision. "Did you think about them, Justice Barrett?" she asked, her voice quieter now but no less intense. "Did you think about the mother who can't afford groceries? The veteran waiting months for medical care? The small business owner barely keeping the lights on?" Still, Barrett offered no response. But for the first time, she shifted slightly in her chair, just a small movement, but enough for Leavitt to notice. She pounced on it. "Tell me, Justice Barrett," Leavitt pressed, "when you cast that deciding vote, did you even think about them?" The room was electric. The murmurs grew louder. Lawmakers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others looking deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't just an attack on a Supreme Court ruling, it was a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the judiciary's power over the will of the people. Leavitt drove the point home. You were supposed to be a conservative firewall against this kind of judicial overreach. That's why President Trump appointed you. That's why millions of Americans believed in you. But when the time came to stand up for them, you chose to betray them instead. For a moment, the chamber was completely still. Even the reporters, who had been furiously taking notes, had paused. Leavitt let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Then, she delivered the final blow. "Justice Barrett," she said, her voice steady and unwavering, "was it worth it?" For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Barrett's face, maybe irritation, maybe discomfort. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And Leavitt saw it. She smirked slightly, shaking her head. "That's what I thought." The room buzzed with whispers. This was more than just political theater, it was a moment of reckoning. A sitting Supreme Court justice was being publicly confronted, not just for her ruling, but for what conservatives saw as a complete abandonment of the principles she was supposed to uphold. Leavitt turned back to the chamber, her gaze sweeping across the audience. "Let's call this what it really is," she said firmly. "This isn't just a bad ruling. This isn't just judicial overreach. This is a betrayal. And every single American watching this right now knows it." The murmurs grew louder. Some lawmakers nodded. Others looked down, unwilling to meet her gaze. But one thing was clear, Karoline Leavitt had just shaken Washington to its core. As the hearing reached its climax, Congresswoman Karoline Leavitt stepped back from the podium, surveying the room. The tension was thick, almost suffocating. Lawmakers sat rigidly in their seats, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Reporters had stopped merely taking notes and were now glued to every word, knowing they were witnessing a pivotal moment. The battle had been waged, Leavitt had exposed what she called a betrayal at the highest levels of government, but she was not done. She turned her gaze toward the cameras, her tone shifting. This was no longer just a hearing inside the halls of Congress, this was a direct appeal to the American people. "I want every American listening to this right now to ask themselves a question," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "When was the last time your government actually fought for you?" The room remained silent. Not for foreign nations. Not for multinational corporations. Not for lobbyists or special interests. But for you, the American worker, the struggling family, the small business owner barely hanging on. A murmur spread through the chamber. Her words struck a nerve. This was not just a speech, it was a rallying cry. Leavitt continued, her voice rising with intensity. She pointed toward Amir Ali, the federal lawyer who had defended the ruling. This man, a lawyer who has never been elected by the people, had the power to argue that your tax dollars should be sent overseas instead of staying right here at home. She then turned to Justice Amy Coney Barrett, her eyes sharp. And this woman, a Supreme Court justice who was given the trust of millions, was the deciding vote that made it happen. She let the weight of her words settle before she drove her message home. And what did the American people get in return? More inflation. More struggling families. More veterans left behind. A low rumble spread through the audience. Some lawmakers nodded. Some journalists looked at each other, their expressions unreadable. This was a moment unlike anything Washington had seen in years. Leavitt wasn't just criticizing a court ruling, she was challenging the entire power structure of the U.S. government. She argued that unelected judges, federal lawyers, and bureaucrats had more control over policy than the very people elected to serve. She framed it as a fundamental issue of democracy, questioning whether the American people truly had any say in their own government. She then took it a step further. If unelected judges can override the President of the United States, she said, if the Supreme Court can ignore the will of the voters, then what do our elections even mean? The silence was deafening. Even those who had dismissed the hearing as political posturing now had to confront the question. What was the point of electing leaders if their decisions could be undone by legal technicalities and court rulings? Leavitt let the moment linger before delivering her final, devastating blow. This wasn't just a bad decision. This was a theft. She turned to the chamber, sweeping her eyes across the room. A theft of power. A theft of trust. A theft of the very democracy we are supposed to be defending. Reporters scribbled furiously, trying to capture every word. This wasn't just a speech, it was a declaration of war against Washington's political establishment. Then, she leaned forward, placing both hands firmly on the podium. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, but it carried like a hammer. And I promise you this, we will take it back. The room erupted into chaos. Lawmakers began shouting. Some applauded, others looked horrified. Reporters scrambled to push out breaking news alerts. Camera shutters flashed, capturing every expression, every reaction. The hearing had spiraled into something much bigger than expected. It was no longer just about a Supreme Court ruling. It had become a referendum on the power of unelected officials versus the will of the American people. Leavitt remained unshaken, unmoved. She had delivered the final blow and stood firm as Washington trembled around her. As she turned to leave, reporters swarmed her, bombarding her with questions. Congresswoman Leavitt, do you believe Justice Barrett should resign? Will you push for legislation to curb judicial overreach? Do you think President Trump will take action after this ruling? Leavitt didn't stop walking, but she turned her head slightly, her voice carrying the same calm authority she had wielded inside the chamber. The American people just saw the truth. Now, it's up to them to decide what comes next. And with that, she disappeared into the halls of Congress, leaving behind a political earthquake. This was no longer just a debate over a legal ruling. This was the beginning of something bigger, a movement, a reckoning, a challenge to the very foundation of how Washington operated. And as the dust settled, one thing became clear: Washington would never be the same again. As the echoes of Congresswoman Karoline Leavitt's fiery speech faded through the halls of Congress, the impact of the hearing remained. This was no ordinary political debate, it was a moment of reckoning, a direct confrontation between elected leaders, unelected judicial figures, and the American people they were supposed to serve. The tension in the chamber, the shocked expressions, and the scrambling reporters were proof that something significant had just unfolded. The battle lines were drawn. Leavitt had made it clear, the government had failed its people. The ruling by the Supreme Court was not just about $2 billion in taxpayer money, it was about who truly holds power in America. If unelected lawyers, judges, and bureaucrats could override the will of the president and the people, then democracy itself was in question. The frustration of working-class Americans, who felt abandoned by Washington, had been given a voice, and that voice had just shaken the very foundations of power. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Leavitt's message was not just a criticism, it was a call to action. A warning that the people would no longer accept being ignored. A promise that change was coming. Lessons learned. The hearing revealed several key lessons about power, accountability, and democracy. Democracy is only as strong as the people's ability to hold leaders accountable. If the voices of voters are overruled by unelected officials, then elections lose their meaning. Judicial overreach can threaten the balance of power. The Supreme Court is meant to uphold the Constitution, but if legal technicalities override the will of the people, the system may no longer serve its purpose. Public trust in government is fragile. When elected officials break promises or betray their base, trust erodes, and the people begin seeking alternatives. Courageous leadership matters. Leavitt's bold confrontation proved that political figures willing to challenge the establishment can inspire movements. Ultimately, this hearing was more than just a political event, it was a wake-up call. And as Washington processed the shockwaves of what had just occurred, one thing was certain, the American people were watching, and they would not forget.